everybody. Welcome to lesson 4.2. Last time we were talking about populations, and I introduced you some of the formulas that allow us to calculate changes in population size. The good news is that we're not going to be looking at any more mathematical processes in the remainder of this unit. And what we're going to do indeed is move on to the next category of ecology, and that is to talk about what a community is. So this is very old now, 2007. Wow, they had the internet back in 2007, as well as some other things which you probably don't recognize. What's this Facebook thing? Anyways, this is a joke, clearly, about a phenomenon called symbiosis, and drawing an analogy between that relationship between two species and the kind of relationship that human beings have, for example, which is a very, very different thing. We're going to talk today about what symbiosis is, amongst many other things. And you're going to see that it's one of the more interesting and more profound relationships that exist in the natural world. And this is an example of a community ecology process, because the community represents all of the organisms that live in an area. Okay, so remember, we had a population, which was all the organisms from one species in that area. Okay, so in this example, all the antelope. When we put all of the different organisms that live here, like snakes and antelopes and hawks and bushes and grasses and so on, bacteria, okay, that creates what we call a community. Okay, so when we're talking about community ecology, we're talking about all of the different processes which occur between species. Okay, not within species, that's population ecology, between two different species. Okay, so if the hawk eats the snake, that's an example of a community level process. Okay, now what makes an ecosystem different is something we'll talk about in the next lesson. Okay, so let's get to symbiosis first. The word symbiosis is from the Greek. Sim means to join, and bio means to live. So we have a word that means to live together, to be joined together. And that's a good way of thinking about what this process is. Any long-term, any significant relationship between two species is called symbiosis. So here we have an example where a fish, this is the clownfish, famous from Finding Nemo, and it lives together with an anemone, which you see here, which is a kind of jellyfish, if you didn't know. This is a polyp, if you remember that term from Unit 3. The fish gains protection from living in amongst the tentacles of the anemone, because the anemone is capable of stinging. It has a special mucus coat that protects it from the stinging cells. And in return, the clownfish will chase away any fish that might want to come and eat these arms, these delicate arms that make up the anemone. So both of the species benefit from their relationships, and that's one of the types of symbiosis, as you'll see. Okay. Now, sometimes symbiotic relationships like this involve two species living together directly. Sometimes they can interact in a way that's less direct, but it can still be a long-term and important part of how they live. So the first type of symbiosis I want to introduce is called commensalism. In commensalism, you get a benefit for one of the partners, but the other partner neither receives a benefit nor harm. And here's an example of a hermit crab living inside of a snail shell. So the two species are the crab and the snail. The crab receives a direct benefit from living inside of this shell because its abdomen is very soft and unprotected, and it can hide inside the shell and gain protection from its predators. However, the snail is dead, Hermit crabs don't kill the snails. They have to wait for the snails to die and for their shells to wash up on the shore, and then they can take them over. Okay, so because the snail is dead, it can't be helped or harmed. It's dead. So this is an example of a commensal relationship between these two species. Benefits the crab, does not benefit the snail. Now, one of the things to say about all these kinds of symbiosis is that all of them have a partner that benefits. Okay, they wouldn't exist, they wouldn't form unless there was an advantage for one of the two species. Okay, it's the relationship with the second partner that matters. Okay, so in this case, the benefit is for the crab, no benefit nor harm for the second partner, the snail. Yeah, the second kind of symbiosis is called mutualism. So if one partner benefits and the other partner also benefits, that's called mutualism. Okay. The word mutual means to share. Okay, so for example, if you have a mutual friend with somebody, that means that you share a friend with that person. So mutualism is a shared relationship between two species. They both benefit. This is a classic example of mutualism, the relationship between pollinators and flowers. Here, this is a bee. The flower has gametophytes, which are these little yellow pollen grains. It has gametophytes, and it wants to move those gametophytes around. It wants to get the male gametophyte, specifically in this case, to the female gametophyte. The best way to do that is for an organism to carry the gametophytes directly to another flower. So the flower attracts the pollinator, which is the bee, with some sort of reward. Often it's a sugary liquid, which is called nectar, but sometimes the pollinator will actually eat some of the pollen as well. Okay. The result is that the bee feeds on the nectar and gets absolutely coated, as you can see here, with these pollen grains, each of which is a little tiny gametophyte. Then the bee will go to another flower, bringing the male gametophyte to the female gametophyte, completing the life cycle for the plant. So there's a huge benefit for the plant, because if they didn't have this pollination, they wouldn't be able to reproduce, they wouldn't be able to make sporophytes and continue their alternation of generations. The benefit for the bee, of course, is the food, which it then brings back to the hive and through a series of processes converts into honey, which it can store for the winter when it needs it. Okay, so both partners receive benefit, so we call that mutualism. The third example is where one partner benefits. Again, there's always a benefit to one partner, and the other organism is directly harmed or indirectly harmed. And this is called parasitism. Okay, so here is an example. Okay, most of us understand things like leeches or tapeworms as being examples of parasites, but here's an example you probably don't know about. This nest is the nest of a bird called a reed warbler. Okay, and there are 4 eggs in this nest. 3 of them, these top 3, belong to the reed warblers. This bottom one, even though it looks similar, is not the same, and it belongs to a different species of bird, which is called the cuckoo, the European cuckoo. The female cuckoo will come, she will eat one of the warbler eggs and lay her own egg inside there. Okay, it's important that she eats one because if you didn't know this, birds can count. Most birds can count up to at least 6. So they would be automatically suspicious if there was an extra egg. This egg, as you can see, is a little bit bigger. And the chick inside develops very quickly and it hatches early, well before the reed warbler chicks get a chance to hatch. It hatches so early that it doesn't even have feathers and its eyes aren't open yet. And its first instinct is to push, and it starts to push all of the other eggs out of the nest until it's the only chick remaining. Okay. The female reed warbler and the male reed warbler then continue to feed this chick, even though clearly it looks nothing like them. Okay, because that's the behavior that they have. They bring food to their nest and they feed the animal that's in the nest because it's their chick, even though it's not their chick. So this cuckoo here is way bigger than the nest, as you can see, because adult cuckoos are much bigger than reed warblers. And it will continue to be fed by the parents until it's big enough to fly away, and then it will fly away and leave them behind. The female cuckoo that laid the egg in the nest is stealing from the reed warblers. She's stealing not only their opportunity to reproduce, which is of course a huge harm to the two parents, but also she's stealing their time and their effort, because they're investing all of that time and effort into growing a chick that doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the cuckoo. So this is an example of the cuckoo harming the warblers. Even though the two of them probably never ever meet, there's still that relationship between those two species. We call that parasitism. There is a group of organisms like this wasp here, which are called parasitoids. The ending OID comes from the Greek, which means like. So if you're a humanoid, you look human-like. If you're a parasitoid, you look like a parasite, but you're actually not. What this particular wasp is called the tarantula hawk, and it will go out and it will actually hunt tarantulas, which is the spider you see here. When it finds one, it will sting it, paralyzing it with its venom, and then it will drag it slowly, as you can see here, dragging it across the ground into a hole which it has dug. It will then lay at least one egg inside of it, and the larval wasp will slowly consume the tarantula from the inside, which is, I'm sure, a truly horrible death, leaving the most essential organs to the end. Okay. Eventually, it does kill the spider, and the wasp pupates inside of the body of the host and then digs its way out and goes off to live its life as a wasp. So these are the stuff of nightmares. They're called parasitoids. There are many, many wasps that do this. A whole big group of them. Each is specific to a particular host. In this case, it's the tarantula. So these are not true parasites, because true parasites do not kill their host. If they did, they would die as well. You know, if a tapeworm inside your body causes you to die, that's the end of the tapeworm. So these are parasitoids. The second process I want to talk about under the heading of community ecology is a process which causes communities to change over time. So at the top here we have a community of plants and animals. It's from Florida. You can see the palm trees. Through this area was a fire, a controlled fire, which was done for the purpose of studying what goes on. And you can see the same sample area after the fire. Okay, all the vegetation has been burned and the tree trunks are all scorched. What the scientists were interested in studying was a phenomenon called succession. And what succession does is it changes the community structure, the species that live in a community over time. So you go from having this scorched community with very few species remaining, and then over time, after 2 months in this case, you can see that the species are starting to return. Okay. Sometimes it's because the plants that live in those ecosystems don't die when they get burnt. Like, for example, you can see this palm tree here is still alive and just sends up new leaves. But also what's happening is there's all this bare ground as a result of the fire, and species that are adapted for this will fly in as seeds or on wings, whatever the case may be, walk in, and they will colonize this bare ground and fill it in. Okay? If we fast forward in another 2 months, it would look different, and there'd be another set of species. 2 years later, it'd be different again. And that process is called ecological succession. Okay? All ecosystems change in this way. They're never static. Okay? And they will change until they reach a stable position. Some communities have a stable endpoint, which is called a climax community. So the species that are able to colonize and begin the process of ecological succession have a name. They're called pioneer species. A pioneer is somebody that goes into an area and begins to use it. Okay. So here we see an example from Hawaii. This is a lava flow. Okay. Into that lava flow has fallen a small seed of a native plant called a koa, and it's germinated and it's beginning to grow right in the lava. So this is an example of a pioneer species. Over time, more of these pioneer species would colonize the lava, and eventually it would be turned into soil. And then other species would come, and then other species, and eventually you'd reach a stable climax community. Okay. So what you get is this situation where, if this is the community changing over time, with the x-axis being time, we have pioneer species here at the outset, which are usually things like mosses and lichens in this case because there's no soil. Those are then replaced by plants that can grow in soil quickly. Okay, so herbs and flowering plants. Those are then replaced by shrubs and eventually by trees. And if finally, after a certain length of time, you reach this stable climax community where the species structure of the community no longer changes. Okay. In some ecosystems, or I should say in some communities, the process of reaching the climax community might take thousands of years, or it might take hundreds of years. Okay. Really rich communities like tropical rainforests, as far as we know, might take tens of thousands of years to reach a true climax community. Another important relationship under the umbrella of community ecology is that between the predator and the prey. And that's because when one organism eats another, that's a really important part of community ecology. So here we have a predator. This is an owl, and the prey, which is a hare in this case. The two of them are, as the slide says, locked together by a co-evolutionary relationship. The predator is evolving new and unique, or new and important ways of, more successful ways, that's what I'm trying to say, new and more successful ways of catching the hare. And the hare is evolving new and more successful ways of trying to escape the predator, the hawk owl. And that's the relationship that they're in. And neither can escape that, because if one gains a complete advantage of the other, then that's not good. We would think of something like a cow as being a predator, but it really is, because it's consuming another organism. It's just that the prey is a plant and it can't escape. Predators that eat plants like cows, we call these herbivores, they usually don't kill their prey. But that's because of the unique way in which plants grow. As we saw in Unit 3, plants can regrow new organs from their tips. As long as their meristems survive, the grasses can continue to grow new leaves. So the cow, through evolution, understands that if it eats just the right amount of the grass, it can come back in a couple of days and eat some more. Okay. So that's a relationship between these two organisms, which is different from the relationship between a lion and a water buffalo. Okay. So a predator that eats another animal, we call a carnivore. They usually kill their prey, and that's because of the way in which animals grow. If the lions came and ate the leg off this water buffalo, the water buffalo would die. It's not like they could come back in a couple of months and the water buffalo would have a new leg. So typically they will kill and eat the whole thing, or as much as they can. Lions don't actually eat very much, and they leave the rest for other scavengers and things to eat. And that makes the relationship between this predator and this prey different than it does between a cow and grass. Another process which occurs in community ecology is when two organisms, two species, compete for a resource. And so if they share any part of their resources with another species, that means that they compete. There is, of course, competition within each species, and that's an important part of how evolution works, but there's also competition between species. So here's an example where if you grow two different species of paramecium, which are unicellular eukaryotes, If you grow them in separate flasks, you get these nice logistic growth curves. Okay? If you grow them together in the same container, the same flask, the two of them are similar enough that they compete for the same food. And the end result is that this red species, P. caudatum, is initially very successful, but then it's not as competitive as the other species and its population declines. Okay? Notice that when they're grown together, neither of them achieves the same population size as when they're grown alone. Okay, so in this case, the blue species, Paramecium aurelia, has a population of under 150, whereas on its own it has a population of over 200. Population density, as they call it, of over 200. So competition results in both organisms being harmed. Okay, it's not a symbiotic relationship in that sense because neither of them wants to compete with each other. The response of most organisms to competition is to divide up the resources that are available in nature. Okay, and that is called niche partitioning. That's the term that ecologists use. And a classic example of that comes from a group of birds called warblers, which feed in conifers on insects and other food sources. And what you can see if you study the feeding habits of these 5 related species of warblers, all of them tend to feed in different parts of the tree. So these ones feed in the interior of the tree. These two on the outside here, feed on the exterior leaves of the tree. And they all tend to try and find their own little part. There are overlaps. For example, there's an overlap here between those two species. They're both feeding on this part of the tree. There's an overlap here between, there's an overlap here between these two species. But in general, they've tried to cut down on the parts of the tree where two species are feeding at the same time, so that they can both benefit from the lack of competition. Another process which happens in communities is you get organisms trying to blend into their environment, and that phenomenon is called camouflage. So here we see a flounder, which is a kind of fish, and this flounder has a really interesting pattern on it, which makes it look like it's made up of pebbles. And against a similar colored backdrop, similar colored environment, it is very difficult to see. Okay, if you were a predator moving by at speed, you probably wouldn't even notice that it was there. So this is called camouflage. Most people understand what camouflage is because we've heard of the military aspects of camouflage, but this is how organisms do it, and organisms did it first. Organisms that eat other organisms, predators in other words, are typically camouflaged so that they can avoid being seen by their prey. So here we see a spider called the white crab spider feeding in a white flower. Okay, so it will wait in this flower. When a pollinator comes to collect some food, it will grab it. Okay, so because it resembles the flower, the prey has difficulty seeing it and therefore thinks it's safe to come in and feed. Prey organisms will often camouflage themselves as well. This is one of the most amazing examples I've ever seen. This genus is called Europea. Meticulodina is this species, also called the dead leaf moth, and it's called that because it has on both of its wings the most amazing three-dimensional appearing pattern of a curled up dead leaf. This is not actually curled around. It's an optical illusion created by the coloration here, which makes it look like this is in shadow. Okay, and similarly here it's got the same counter shading. It's just hairs on the surface of the wing, but it's a very effective camouflage. And again, if you were passing by quickly as a predator, you might just look at that and say, oh, that's just a leaf, and keep going. So here we see an example of camouflage. That's what's being shown here. Camouflage. Okay, so we have a stick insect. looking like stick. Okay. Stick insects are not only elongated so that they have the overall shape of a stick, but they also move in a very unusual way. They have sort of a halting, almost drunk look when they walk, which makes them look like something other than an insect. If you don't believe me, look it up. Stick insects walk in a very unusual way because they're trying to appear as something other than an insect. They're trying to look like a stick. So this is camouflage, an organism resembling its environment. Okay. Now you'll say, well, Mr. Buller, this stick is alive. That's an organism. Yes, you're right. But typically when organisms resemble plants, that's often considered camouflage and not the next process that we're about to talk about, which is called mimicry. Mimicry is similar to camouflage in that you have an organism trying to look like something else, but in this case, what it's trying to look like is another organism rather than its environment. So here's an amazing example. Cyamosotima aranea. Aranea is from the Greek for spider. This is called the spider moth. The moth, when it's at rest, holds its wings upward and it displays this incredible pattern which looks like a series of legs with maybe some big eyes here. And it really strongly resembles a spider. Okay. So this is an example of mimicry. Prey organisms will frequently use mimicry to look like something that's dangerous. And in doing so, they will gain protection from their predators. This particular organism is called Papiliotroilus. It's a kind of swallowtail butterfly, a spice bush swallowtail butterfly, if you want to look it up. It's a beautiful butterfly. The caterpillar is this thing. Now, if you saw this on a leaf, you'd think, oh, okay, well, that's the head. Okay, well, actually, it isn't. The head is down here. Okay, these enormous eyes make the upper part of the caterpillar look like something that's much bigger and more dangerous than it actually is. And there are species of caterpillars that do a much better job of mimicking snakes, for example. There's one that even has that characteristic sort of diamond head shape of a snake. And when they're bothered, they'll rear up like a snake does to confuse their predator. So this is an example of mimicry because this caterpillar, this swallowtail caterpillar, is trying to look like something that is not another organism. Predators will also use mimicry as well, and they will try to look like something that isn't harmful, so harmless. Oh, there's a species, so it should be an E in there. In order to get close to their prey. This, at first glance, looks like an ant, doesn't it? But it's actually not an ant. If you count the number of legs, 2, 4, 6, 8 in total, this is a spider. An ant only has 6 legs. You can also see all the little eyes on the top, which is characteristic of spiders. It's actually a jumping spider, if you know your spiders. And these jaws here are greatly enlarged, which make it look like it's a long ant. And with, I would say quite convincingly, looks like an ant. There are lots of spiders, by the way, that are ant mimics. This is not the only one. And this allows them to get really close to ants because ants are not very smart, especially when they're using their sense of sight. And then they can just eat as many ants as they want. So here we see an example of mimicry in the notes. Mimicry. Here we have 2 species of butterfly which resemble each other. This particular species of butterfly is harmful, let's say. Many caterpillars of butterflies will feed on a host plant when they're young, which is poisonous. And then when they're adults, they keep those toxins in their body. So a lot of predators will know that if they see that butterfly, they won't eat it because it either tastes terrible or is quite literally poisonous. This butterfly is not. This is a harmless mimic species. So when the species here mimics the harmful species, it gains the protection from predators that this species has. It's in effect, it's kind of stealing from the other species that relationship. And if it resembles this harmful species enough, it will gain protection from predators. Even if it's a tiny amount, even if they get 10% less predation than they would otherwise get, that's a big advantage for the second species. And so that's how these sorts of relationships evolve. Okay. One of the frequent criticisms of people that don't believe in evolution is, how can you get these mimicry situations setting themselves up when they have to look so precise? The answer is they don't need to look precise. If this second species, it looks 1% like this species, and that gives it an advantage, then that's evolution working. And then 2%, and then 3%, and then 4%, and eventually they can end up looking very, very similar to each other. Almost indistinguishable, unless you're a butterfly expert. So those are camouflage and mimicry, two processes which cause organisms to look like other things. So the next lesson is 4.3. We're going to talk about ecosystems, and you will see how ecosystems are different from communities. I mentioned that at the beginning. So please take the time, if you haven't already done so, to fill in your notes. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks very much, and bye for now.